Thank you, Rotarians. President Frank, Rotarians and our guests, it's my particular duty today to formally welcome and introduce Professor Paddy Phillips as our guest speaker for today's luncheon. Professor Phillips, or Paddy as I introduced him to a number of members today, biographical details, I would describe them, have been circulated in the bulletin, and I won't be, in the interest of time, I will only refer to the more significant roles and achievements. Perhaps before doing so, can I just say that we are all in this room have a keen interest in the public health area, and the areas that I would, not necessarily for Paddy to comment on, but our own particular interests, how the health services are delivered, and how and by whom they are accessed, and the cost, the significant cost in the state budget. I think it's number one in the, or 30%. So we do have an interest in public health. Paddy, whilst not born in Adelaide, but I won't go into that detail, I'll leave it to you, Paddy, to comment on that. He is the Chief Medical Officer, and he will give a very detailed outline of that role. He was previously Professor and Head of Medicine at the Flinders University, Flinders Medical Centre and the Repatriation General Hospital. He was the Chair of the South Australian Clinic Senate and the inaugural Chair of the South Australian Statewide Clinical Network in Cardiology. He's also been a member of a number of national committees, including the National Health and Medical Research Council, the Royal Australian Council of Physicians, and also held senior clinical and academic posts at both the University of Melbourne and Oxford, and is the Adjunct Professor of Medicine at Duke University in the US. His interests are in building a better health system through innovation, collaboration and leadership, and is the overall clinical lead for the implementation of the South Australian Electronic Health Record, I think known as EPAS. He remains clinically active in acute general medicine, and I would now ask Rotarians and guests, would you please formally welcome Paddy.
Thank you, Dick, and thank you for inviting me, so, Mr. President and Rotarians. It's a great pleasure to be here. I'll tell you a little bit about my background and then a little bit about what I do, but I'll try and leave plenty of time so that you can ask questions, because I think that'll be where I can get to the crux of what people might want to know about. So first of all, the name Paddy. Yeah, it is Paddy. My brother's Patrick. My parents were Peter and Peggy, and my family is Penny, Patrick, Pippa, Paddy and Prudence. So when they got to me, they couldn't work out what was a good name, boy's name starting with P. They didn't like Paul, and Phillips was a bit strange, and Poindexter and Percival they didn't like, so they decided to call me Paddy. And so I am known by Paddy, and I'm quite happy to be called Paddy, so please feel free to do so. My background is that my parents were itinerant academics. My father was a historian and my mother was a language teacher. They were from England and came to Perth initially in the early 50s, where my father worked at the University of Western Australia, and then he got a job at the University of Witwatersrand in Johannesburg. And so they went to Johannesburg for a few years, where I was born. However, apartheid didn't agree with them very much, and they left Johannesburg when I was one and came to Adelaide. So I grew up in Adelaide. I went to Linden Park Primary and Adelaide Boys High School, and then the University of Adelaide. And I enjoyed my time at the University of Adelaide, and I really enjoyed medical school. I thought it was a wonderful time, and the learning was fantastic. And I got a taste for academia there. And so in my final year of medicine, I applied for scholarships to go overseas, and I was lucky enough to win a scholarship to go to the University of Oxford. I deferred that for a year so I could get my internship out of the way and become fully registered, and went to Oxford and did a PhD in human water balance and how we control our water balance in our bodies. I then approached a few people in Oxford and asked them where I should go, and they recommended that I go to Melbourne. Melbourne still is the research centre for Australian medical research and receives roughly about 40% of the NHMRC research funding. And I went there to complete my training in internal medicine and also to start an academic career. And I started that at Prince Henry's Hospital, which is on St Kilda Road. It's now a block of apartments. It was knocked down in the 90s. And then at the Austin Hospital, where I trained in general internal medicine with an interest in cardiovascular disease. I continued the academic side and was initially an NHMRC postdoctoral fellow and then a senior lecturer and then associate professor in the Department of Medicine for the University of Melbourne at the Austin Hospital, and was really quite interested in how the body controls blood pressure and salt and water balance. And then in the mid-90s, I was approached by my ex-supervisor from Oxford about taking his position in Oxford. And I sort of said, no, don't be ridiculous, there'll be lots of other people who you might want to appoint ahead of me. And then he said, no, you should apply. And I happened to be visiting Oxford to say farewell because he was retiring, and he said, I've arranged all these appointments for you to meet these people. And so I met a variety of people and ended up throwing my hat in the ring, and I was appointed to the position called the May Reader in Medicine, which is quite a prominent position in British academic medicine, and moved lock, stock and barrel, sold up and moved from Melbourne to Oxford, and started working there. And it was then I realised what a great health system Australia has. The NHS in '96 was diabolically bad. It was very ageist. The access to tests that we would consider routine was incredibly suboptimal. A test that we would have access to 24 hours a day to diagnose clots in the lung at that time was available on Wednesdays. So make sure you get sick on the right day. A whole variety of ageism occurred. So if you're over 65, you wouldn't get into coronary care if you had a heart attack. You would be unlikely to get coronary artery bypass surgery. You certainly wouldn't be dialysed. There were very strong problems with access and the quality of healthcare. And because of that, I became very disillusioned. And I was lucky enough to be approached about coming back to South Australia after a long period away. And so I spent 12 years in Melbourne after 3 years in Oxford, and then another 18 months in Oxford. And I moved back to Adelaide to take up the combined role as Professor of Medicine for Flinders University, the Director of what's called the Division of Medicine, Cardiac and Critical Care, which is internal medicine, all of those subspecialties, cardiology, renal medicine, respiratory, etc., and intensive care, and at both Repat and Flinders, and then in the last little while at Noarlunga as well. And during my time in Oxford, not only have I become disillusioned with the healthcare system, but I started to question some of my clinical academic colleagues' approaches to medicine in terms of innovation. Many of them were incredibly clever, famous, successful clinical scientists or scientists in basic biomedical research, so in the laboratory dealing with test tubes and so on. And some of them still did clinical medicine, but when they went into clinical medicine, they kind of switched off their innovation and always did things the same way. And I started to question the whole issue of why do we do things the same way? And really, when I came to South Australia, I started to get involved in innovation and started to get a bit of a name for being a bit of a change agent. Sometimes people like that, and sometimes they didn't. And at times, the old adage of you can't make an omelette without breaking a few eggs applied. And we were able to do some quite interesting things. And it was then that I became a bit passionate about innovation in the health system. And I believe it's actually, as me as a doctor employed in the health system, whether it be as a university person or a health system person or a combination, as most clinical academics are, it was our obligation actually to bring innovation, to test new things, to try to make the system better. And I've tried to continue that throughout my career. In 2007, I was approached about taking on the roles in the Clinical Senate and the Cardiology Network, and we started getting those things going. The Senate had fallen into a bit of a lull in terms of its success, and we managed to reinvigorate it and got it involved in a number of things and so on. And because I'd been involved in those things, the then Chief Executive asked me if I would act in the position of Chief Medical Officer when my predecessor, Chris Bagley, was approached about acting in a national role in Sydney. And so I said, okay, I'm not sure what that involves. And so we had a chat about it, and then I talked to Chris, and he said, yes, I'm definitely coming back in 6 months. And I said, fine, well, that's great, because I want you to come back, because I don't want this position ongoing. I want to go back to what I was doing before, because I was enjoying it. And of course, the inevitable happened, and Chris stayed on, and I was approached about staying on. And I said to the Chief Executive, when we sort of finally came to a bit of an agreement, of course, you know, I don't do media. And I'd had some bad experiences with media in the past, and I prefer actually to be in the background, not in the foreground. And he said, oh, there'll be a little bit. And there started by being a little bit. And then in 2009, H1N1 swine flu came along, and I started to get into the media quite a bit and developed a bit of a relationship with the media. And the media actually in 2009 with H1N1 swine flu were extremely helpful, and we had a very good relationship in terms of providing information in a transparent and open way. Rules around the media, around release of patient-based information. Of course, we never release patient information, that's confidential, and we made that absolutely clear that we wouldn't give any information to the media that would identify a patient. And we developed a respectful relationship, and of course that's still the case in terms of I do public health media. My role when I took up the position just over 5.5 years ago on a full-time basis is to provide clinical advice to the Minister and senior executives in the Department of Health, to be involved in workforce planning, and to help with clinical communications, which was code which I didn't understand at the time, for being involved in the media. Do I enjoy being involved in the media? No. Do I think it's important? Yes, because we do get very important public health messages out. Recently, measles, and measles can be a nasty illness. I think pretty much almost everyone in the room probably was exposed to measles as a kid, as was I, and we used to sort of take it for granted. But when you look at the statistics, it can be very nasty, and it can be fatal. And vaccination has been a huge mainstay in reducing that burden of illness in our society, as has vaccination for a number of other illnesses. And I was hearing before that Rotary is integral in the eradication of polio from the world, which is just around the corner. There's only small pockets of polio now in a few countries around Pakistan and Afghanistan, and there's been a couple of outbreaks in a few years ago in Western Africa. So vaccination and public health messages are fundamental. And of course, Rotary, as was said at the beginning, plays a major role. One of my other roles is one of my other roles is the electronic health record, but I am fortunate enough to be given some latitude in what I do. And so there's certain routine things about what I have to do, and I have to do things like approve positions of what are called area of need for practices or hospitals who cannot recruit an Australian doctor into a position, to allow a foreign doctor to come in and be registered to take up a position in that hospital. That's one of my one of the responsibilities of my position. And I'm involved in some other structural committees, as Dick mentioned, the National Health and Medical Research Council, and some other national federal government committees. But apart from a relatively small number of must-dos, I'm allowed to pick and choose a lot of what I'm interested in doing. And so one of the things that I am doing at the moment is developing a medical workforce strategy for South Australia with a small team that I'm working with. You might be surprised to know that no state in Australia has a medical workforce strategy, which surprised me when I came in and was looking for one recently. New Zealand does. We have an organisation federally called Health Workforce Australia, which is tasked with providing statistics and developing some information about that. But really, developing a strategy around health workforce has been a bit of a no-go area because of the medical politics around it. But we're in a position where we actually need one. Dick said that health is expanding, the health spend is growing at a fast rate. When I came to South Australia, it was just under $2 billion. Over the last 15 years, it's now $5 billion. It's 30%, it was 20% of the state's budget then, it's 30% of the state's budget now. It's predicted that by the mid-2040s, if things don't change, the whole of the state's budget could be being spent on health. Now that's not sustainable and clearly won't happen. But the issue is how do we spend our money better and more wisely to get better outcomes, better value for our health spend. And part of that is about actually being more innovative with the way we use workforce. And that's medical workforce, but it's all the other workforce, clinical professionals in our workforce as well. Part of that is the electronic health record. Who here still uses a bank book? 2 people. Do you use it? Do you use internet banking as well? No? 1 person? No? Okay. I remember the first time I used an ATM. It was in England in 1981. That was when banking went electronic for me, and that's over 30 years ago. You may be surprised to realise that we still use the equivalent of bank books in the public health system. So paper-based case notes, where transactions are paper-based. You request tests with a paper form. Not so much now, but a few years ago we still just got paper-based reports. South Australia's been moving to an electronic health record over the last decade, since the Generational Health Review in 2003 made that recommendation, and there's been a very strong foundation infrastructure put in terms of the fibre optic networks, the server capacity, and a whole lot of things that have made it possible for us this year to go live with our first hospital with a full electronic health record. So No Longer Hospital is the first hospital in South Australia and one of only 2, I think, in Australia to be fully electronic, to have really entered the 21st century in terms of the way we use records in healthcare. We had a very significant amount of preparation over the last 3 years for that, and our plan is now to roll it out across the rest of South Australia, initially in metropolitan Adelaide over the next 12 to 16 months or so. And then to take it further into country. Currently only Mount Gambier and Port Augusta hospitals are listed in country, and the reason why more of country isn't initially in the rollout was because of the issue of the budgetary constraints which were in place in 2011 when the contract was signed. That innovation will help us understand what we do. Those of you in the finance industry and in other industries, I'm sure you can, at the press of a button, get the information about your products, how you spend your money, what you spend it on, that sort of thing. Well, we can get that too for our financial reports, but we can't get any of that for clinical. So if we want to do an audit, we have to go to the paper-based record, look up that information for each and every patient for that particular time, write it down or put it into a computer, analyse it, and then we get a snapshot for what's happening. How many people are being discharged on the right drugs, for example, after a heart attack. And we would know that for November 2013, but if we wanted to do that again next year, we'd have to go through the same process, paper-based audit of records. Now, in the 21st century, I think that's unacceptable. When we've had financial information available for a very long time, over 30 years, that would provide that type of information to tell us how we're travelling in the quality of our financial ways of doing business. Why can't we do that for the clinical ways of doing business? And that's exactly why I've taken on this clinical lead role in EPAS. I'll throw it open to questions. I'm happy to answer questions on anything. I am apolitical, and so I won't get into any political discussions, but I'm delighted to answer anything you might want to ask. Cool.
From time to time we read about meningococcal disease. Could you talk a little about what progress has been made in addressing that problem?
Sure. So meningococcal disease is caused by a bug called Neisseria meningitidis, which is a bug that lives in a very significant number of people's bodies symptomlessly. So about 10% of the population carry meningococcus in their nose and throat, And for some reason, it then decides to invade, and we don't understand quite why. There are certain genetic reasons why it that you can be predisposed to it invading, but they're very rare. The vast majority of people who catch it, we don't understand why they are susceptible. There are vaccines available for 2 of the subtypes, but the most common subtype we see is subtype B, and there isn't a vaccine for subtype B. And that's why it is a big deal. Meningococcal is very treatable if it's caught early, but it can be extremely fast in its progression and be fatal, and that's why it's a big deal. And so that's why we go out and tell people that there is a case and that what we're doing about it. In fact, that's what we do about all of the significant public health diseases, is we have a significant amount of transparency about that. And that's partly why meningococcal is not so much of a news story as it was maybe 10 years ago, because it has become, the transparency is there. Vaccines are part of the research work that's being done in a number of research institutes. I don't think it's going to be done in SAMRI specifically. They have an interest in vaccines, but not that I'm aware of in that particular one. Has been trying to get a vaccine for meningococcal type B, but it's not yet been successful. When it will be, that'll be a major advance.
Paddy, some months ago, probably a year ago or two, Medicare Australia they sent out letters to everybody, I think, to embrace electronic records for their local GP. Now I figured out it was quite a protracted process. It seems to have hit the wall. I think it seems conceptually a great idea. What are your thoughts?
Yeah, the personally controlled electronic health record has been developed by the federal government, and it's a summary of health records. So it includes issues about what medication someone might be on, allergies, and other simple information. Initially, it was an opt-in, and it still is an opt-in that you sign up for it. And initially, it got the medical profession offside because people would be able to edit the information. And so that would mean that as a doctor, I might look on it and it might not have all the information that I might need to help make decisions. Also, I would spend time looking for it, possibly, and in some instances, if someone was, say, unconscious, it might not be there because it was an opt-in process. The concept of continuous information between all health professionals sharing the same information is a fundamentally good one, I think. I think the PCEHR, as its acronym is, has been flawed in its implementation through a variety of processes. And I think we will end up getting something much more meaningful down the track but at the moment it's not yet hit that tipping point for people, either the population to take it up or medical practitioners to be involved. Also, there was a lot of argument for a long time about GPs putting in the information and not being reimbursed for their time for it, and of course that causes problems in a business like general practices.
Time for one more question, thanks. Albert?
Do you believe that the increase in percentage of healthcare cost is partly to blame, part of it's to blame with over-servicing?
Depends what you mean by over-servicing. When I was an intern and I worked at the Royal Adelaide, it was pretty much what I described in the mid-90s. So I was an intern 1980. In the mid-90s in the NHS, where if you're over 65, you didn't get bypass surgery. Then you didn't get, if you had kidney failure due to diabetes, now the most common cause of kidney failure, you wouldn't get chronic dialysis. If you're over 70, you probably wouldn't get chemotherapy. If you think that treating people in those age groups with those diseases, which are eminently treatable, is over-servicing, I'm not saying it's a rhetorical question. Rhetorical, it's not you personally. If others think that's over-servicing, well, maybe we are. Personally, I think that's good healthcare. I'm sure there is a small proportion of practitioners who perhaps over-service through that's what they think is the right thing to do, and I think there's a tiny, tiny proportion of practitioners who do the wrong thing and over-service. But I think what's happened is that we have a healthier population. We're able to do things much more safely. Anaesthetics, for example, are much safer now. And we've been able to expand that into populations who previously just weren't, it was the practice that they didn't get access to those. And I think that's been to very great benefit for our population and our community. How far can we go? Well, that's a big question mark. How much of the health budget can we afford to spend? That's going to be a community decision ultimately. And I think, but it is time to have that debate, I think.
Thank you very much, Paddy. Unfortunately, we have Rotarians. Sorry, do you need treatment?
Need a doctor?
Rotarians, thank you very much, Paddy, for that, giving us your time and also the information and knowledge. But I'm sure by the questions it was very clear of the interest. So thank you very much. And Rotarians, so I present Paddy with our usual memento.
Thank you, Paddy. I don't think there'll be many in this room that would worry about over-servicing. Just one question. When will we get to the situation where we actually carry our own personal medical records as a chip on our driver's license or in a credit card or an equivalent? It gets away from large bureaucracies, and I can walk into any primary doctor and say, this is who I am and this is my problem.
The technology's there, and you can actually sign up to international medical record through Google, but it's not there in a way that everyone would be willing to sign up to, including the practitioners. But I think it's around the corner.
Okay. Gets rid of big bureaucracies.